Hello everybody, welcome to the 2022 Sophos Security SOS Week. If you're a first timer to the SOS Week, welcome for the first time. For those of you who have listened in before, welcome back. Today's topic on day one of this year's week is preventing cyber threats. Stop them before they stop you. And our guest today is none other than Mr. Fraser Howard, Director of Research at SOPHOSLABS. Now, those of you who have listened to SOS Week before will know that I like to describe Fraser as a specialist in everything, because his knowledge is not just broad, it is also incredibly deep. He ticks every cell in the spreadsheet, you could say. So Fraser, welcome back to the SOS Week. And this year, I wanted to start by focusing on something that goes by the name of LOLBIN, which I believe is short for Living Off the Land Binary, which is jargon for software that's there already that the crooks love to use.
Exactly that, yeah.
And the big problem at the moment seems to be that the most likely LOLBIN, or the most likely pre-installed program that the crooks will dine out on, for want of a better phrase, is nothing other than PowerShell, which is built into Windows. It's available on every version of Windows as soon as you install it, and it's kind of like the medium of management these days for Windows itself. So how do you live without it?
Exactly. So just like you described, from the attacker's perspective, LOLBINs are brilliant. So, they either bring their own knife to the fight, and their knife might look very different to everything else that's on the system, or they use a knife that just happens to be present on the system in the first place. And that is advantageous to the attacker for obvious reasons. Any security software, any software on the system that's monitoring different applications won't see some brand new, shiny, unknown application suddenly being run and used in part of the attack. And so tools like PowerShell are already there. And so when somebody starts using PowerShell legitimately or maliciously, that's when the games begin in terms of trying to work out, is it something good or is it something bad? And so, I wish there was a one-line answer to how we detect malicious PowerShell versus benign, but actually it's quite a complex situation. And now, so typically we look at behavior. What exactly is the PowerShell process doing itself? On one end of the spectrum, you could use technology like, for example, application control, and as an admin, you could choose, PowerShell, you should not be allowed to run in my environment. And that's kind of a panacea, if you like, and it would stop PowerShell being abused, but it would also break lots of legitimate activity, including kind of core management and administration of most Windows machines today. Okay,
so application control is Sophos's name for the ability to detect and optionally to block software that is not malware, but that a well-informed administrator might not want to support in their environment.
Exactly.
So it might not even be malicious.
Oh, absolutely not.
So you could say, well, I want to allow Edge and I want to allow people the choice of Firefox, but all the other browsers, man, I'm not going to support those. So Chrome, you can't use it. Brave, love your work, can't use it. And you can make selections. Pinball, not allowed, was a favourite one in the old days.
And exactly, and it's not just about kind of admins and their kind of you could say questionable choice of which application should my users be allowed to use. It's about kind of basics. If you think about security, what's one of the things that we've been telling people for the last 5-10 years? Patch. If you're an administrator and you're allowing anybody to use whatever application they want for their browser, that's probably 10, maybe 5-10 different browsers that you have to patch, manage. When there's a new vulnerability in that browser, you have to kind of say, okay, well, is this being used in my network? Actually, for admins, technologies like application control let them narrow that window of that kind of threat surface, and so they know that only one browser is allowed in their environment. They don't really care then if there's vulnerabilities in the 9 other browsers out there, because that's not an application that they have to worry about patching and managing anymore.
But when it comes to scripting languages, by which I mean programs that take text files and run them, interpret them as if they were programs, thereby you don't have to write something in C and compile it to make an executable that could stand out. You just have a text file that could even run straight out of memory. Now, scripting languages, I imagine that in most networks, if you decided, well, Python, maybe we're just going to learn to live without it. Perl, we're going to learn to live without it. good luck, but you could try. You could conceive of blocking those, but PowerShell, some people say, oh, just block PowerShell.exe, block all .ps1 files, job's done. But
it's not quite as simple as that.
Could a sysadmin manage without PowerShell in a modern Windows network?
No. Quite simply, no. I mean, there are policy options that they could choose to only allow certain signed scripts, for example, to be run. But there's a whole variety of kind of little tips and techniques that the attackers know that try to bypass some of those mechanisms as well. And you're right. Some of the older scripting engines, probably the best example is Windows Scripting Host. Most people don't know it's there. It's not the kind of one-stop shop for admin that PowerShell is, but WScript and CScript, these binaries, again, are on every single Windows box. They are a lot more feasible to outright block, and they get abused again by malware.
So it's not just PowerShell. It's not just PowerShell. It's also, so the Windows Scripting Host includes things like JavaScript, not running in your browser, running outside your browser, and good old Visual Basic Script.
And there's a whole host of them.
Now, Visual Basic Script it's kind of discontinued by Microsoft, isn't it? But it's still supported and still very, very widely used.
Very popular with the bad guys,
by the good guys, so that the crooks still love it.
Yes, yeah.
And the same with...
And it's not just scripting engine either. There's I think, I don't know, I can't remember exactly how many binaries are on some of the kind of the main lol bin lists that are out there, but it's many tens of different binaries. There's binaries that you wouldn't necessarily associate with being capable of doing anything with external servers, for example, with the right kind of combination of switches. All of a sudden, a binary that you might use to manage kind of, I don't know, for example, certificates locally, actually can be used to download any content from a remote server and save it to disk locally.
Is that certutil.exe?
It is certutil, for example.
Because that can also be used to do things like calculate file hashes.
Yep.
So you don't need to carry around a file name that gives away. Yep. You just carry the hash. And people think, oh, well, hashing code, that's suspicious.
Yep.
But so it looks like certutil makes it look as though your script is doing something really useful. Oh, I'm validating security. But in fact, using not a secret, but one of its lesser known options to.
It could be used to download, for example, base64 encoded executable content, save it locally and decode it. And then that content could be run as a way of potentially getting through your kind of web gateways, for example.
And that gets even worse with PowerShell, doesn't it? Because my understanding is this was to avoid the possibility that files might get mangled in translation and line endings modified and characters substituted, that you can take a base64 encoded string and feed that into PowerShell as the input script.
Yes.
And it will quietly decode it for you. So just one line with no spaces, no carriage returns, no line feeds, one line of PowerShell. And you can even put in a command line option, can you not, to say, hey, if the user said, don't allow scripts to execute from the command line, ignore it.
Yes.
I wish to override that.
Yeah. And you've mentioned PS1 files, so that's the physical script file that might exist on disk.
Yeah.
Actually, PowerShell is pretty adept at doing things filelessly. So just the command line itself can contain the entirety of the PowerShell command.
And that can be a pipe, can't it? Where one command produces an output that's in memory, and that memory gets read in as if it were a file. That's called fileless malware.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding is most so-called fileless malware does involve files, probably quite a lot of files in its operation, but there will be a key point at which something you might detect only exists in memory, so security software that is only able to monitor disk will miss out. So how do you deal with that kind of situation where the crooks have got all this semi-suspicious stuff and then they've disguised the really dangerous bit with this sort of fileless memory-only trick? How do you deal with that?
One of the ways we deal with that, particularly in regards to PowerShell, is Microsoft provide an interface which gives us visibility into the behavior of PowerShell. So the AMSI or AMSI is an interface which security vendors can use to get a peep into exactly what
anti-malware scanning interface.
It's like it gives us a window into kind of the behavior of PowerShell at any point in time. So as it might be doing things filelessly, and so any kind of traditional interception points which are looking for files on disk, they won't be coming into play. Actually, the behavior of PowerShell itself will generate activity, if you like, within that particular interface, which gives us the ability to recognize and block certain types of malicious PowerShell activity. The other thing is, fileless is, again, seen as a bit of a panacea for the bad guys. They're avoiding any sort of interception in terms of the disk itself and file activity. But actually, one of the things that most attackers are after at some point is what we call persistence. So, okay, they've got some code running on a machine. What happens if that machine is restarted? What happens if that machine is powered down and the user comes back in tomorrow, the attacker typically wants to have their code
or
running
that process
at that point.
that they've compromised just ends.
And so their fileless malware typically will seek to add some level of persistence. So most of the fileless attacks that we've seen actually is interaction typically with the Windows registry, and it uses a registry as a way of achieving persistence. So typically put some sort of blob of data in the registry and modify some registry keys such that when such that when that machine is restarted, that blob is decoded and malicious behavior carries on again. And so again, that provides another interception point. So it's a very interesting point. So, thinking of today's security products as, how do they work, what they intercept file activity, that's like one very small facet of what today's security product actually does. Today's products are all about a whole range of technologies, from simple right through to quite extraordinarily quite complex, in order to kind of recognize malicious behavior.
That also, as a sort of side note, helps to explain why people take files that they're kind of the precursors of malware, but not overtly malicious themselves, upload them to an online service like, say, VirusTotal, and go, hey, nobody detects this.
Yes.
All security products are useless. And the point is that they're only taking a snapshot of the file when it arrives, where it's deliberately designed to just sit there looking innocent. Now, it would be nice if you could detect it at that point reliably, but if you can't, it doesn't mean that file can spring into life and start doing bad stuff without getting stopped.
That's a very good point. And so I think it's something that the security industry has tried, but the fact that we still talk about it, we've probably failed to get that point across. What is protection? What do we actually mean? What does protecting someone against a threat typically mean? Most people tend to think of it, okay, they have a threat. They want a file. That file, that's the threat. And they want to see, is that file detected? Now, the fact that particular attack, let's suppose it's a bot. There might be 10,000 of those files every single day as the bad guys kind of turn the handle and churn out lots of different replicants that essentially are all the same basic thing. And so the fact that 1 or 10 or 100 of those files are detected, actually it doesn't really tell you very much about how well a product might protect against that threat.
Against the 101th, the 100 and,
exactly.
And then you say 102th.
And and their business in turning that handle, they use automation, they use tools, there's online services the bad guys kind of basically rent out to each other that allow them to create multiple copies of this file. And when I say copy, I don't mean an actual, just an exact copy. I mean a derivative, if you like.
Version 7,806, version 7,809.
Exactly. Where fundamentally it's the same basic thing. But if you look at it from start to finish, from the first byte in the file through to the last byte in the file, they're completely different. But actually, when you run them on a system, they're essentially the same thing. And so actually, when we talk about how you protect people against threats, what we really should be talking about nowadays is, okay, there's important classes of malware. There's bots, there's ransomware, there's different threat families that people are familiar with.
Software robot.
Essentially.
That's something that sits on your computer regularly calling home or polling some random server. It may change from day to day or hour to hour.
Very frequently.
Download a list of instructions. So that could be here's a list of email addresses to spam next.
It could
here's a list of file extensions I want you to scramble. Here, turn on the keylogger.
Exactly.
Take a screenshot right now. They're in the banking app.
We tend to use the term bot as a way of saying, okay, when that machine is infected with a bot, actually there's some sort of external communication going out periodically. And
it's essentially an active, a semi-active backdoor.
It is a backdoor, yeah.
A backdoor, and
we spoke about backdoor 20 years ago. I remember doing customer presentations 20 years ago, talk about backdoors.
Back orifice, if you remember.
Yeah, I mean, and back then we were trying to convince customers that actually a lot of the backdoors out there were more important than the mass mailer of that day, or the kind of fast burn, high profile malware of that day. Actually, what you don't want to get infected with are the backdoors, which allow some miscreant somewhere the ability to control your machine and do bad stuff, have a look through your file system, modify data on your system. That's a far more, in many ways, frightening threat than for example, a self-replicating worm that just spreads from computer to computer. That might get the press and it might cause problems in and of itself, but actually somebody having access to your system is arguably a much bigger threat.
Indeed. And I guess if you have a bot on your computer, the idea that you, like thinking back to back orifice in, 1999, 2000, that famously, it listened on port 13337, didn't it?
Good memory,
Elite. And the idea was that as soon as people started getting onto DSL connections at home and having a home router, it was useless because inbound connections didn't work. And so people thought, oh, well, backdoors, they rely on inbound network connections. I'm protected by my ISP by default. I don't have to worry about it. But today's zombies, today's bots,
it's all over
super
HTTPS.
agents, they call home at a regular or perhaps even on an irregular basis using some kind of encrypted or secretive channel. And they download the instructions. And they can move from place to place. So,
and because it's on HTTPS, they use HTTPS. So essentially, they basically hide that network activity amongst the kind of 1,000,001 other web packets that go out every minute of most home connections.
So that's another reason why this defense in depth or layered protection, where you're looking, you obviously knew files you want to examine because you don't want to miss malware that you could have detected, but that file could be innocent at the moment. And it could turn out to be rogue after it's loaded, after it's manipulated itself in memory, after it's called out and downloaded stuff. So your job and your sort of future gazing, if you like, is to try and predict all the ways in which we can anticipate how bad software might differ from good software in its behavior and raise the alarm and jump in if necessary.
Yeah, and so to get back to the kind of original point, so how we measure security products today is more complex than it ever has been before. But
because some people still have the idea that, well, if you really want to test a product, you just get a giant bucket full of malware, which all in files and zip files, and some of them might be memory dumps that would never exist in a file. So they don't need to be detected in a file. I mean, it might be nice if you could, but why bother if it's not how the thing would exist? And then you put that on a server in isolation somewhere and you scan it with a static scanner and you find out how many it detects, and that tells you how the product behaves. The virus total approach. That will tend to underestimate good products, and it might overestimate bad products, because products that block things that they shouldn't block but would get in the way, they could do very well if they're just scanning a bucket of known bad stuff. They just say, oh, it's all bad.
Or products that...
Be afraid.
That aim to specialize in detecting kind of purely files. For the purpose of primarily looking good in those sort of kind of zoo-based tests. Doesn't necessarily mean, that doesn't translate to a product that in a real world will translate to actually providing good levels of protection. And in reality, in terms of what we protect, we block files, of course we do. The files is still a very important kind of currency, if you like, in terms of protection. But there's lots of other things, for example, like the AMSI interface that lets us block malicious PowerShell activity, behavior itself. And so within our product, the behavioral engine looks at the behavior of processes, network traffic, threads, all sorts of things, registry activity. And that kind of combined picture lets us spot potentially malicious behavior for the purpose of blocking not necessarily a specific family or even a particular kind of threat, but just like malicious activity. If there's certain types of behavior that we can determine are just outright malicious, we will often try and block that. And that can be a good thing, because we can block a certain type of malicious behavior today, and then a threat family that's not even yet written in 3 months' time might use that same behavior, and we'll proactively detect it. So that's the holy grail of what we do, proactive protection. The ability for us to write something today that in the future will successfully block malicious behavior.
I suppose a good example of that, to go back to what we mentioned before, is that certutil.exe utility that you may be using. Certutil, it's a certificate validation utility. You might be using that in your own scripts, in your own sysadministration tools, in your own managing the network life, because it's very useful if you want to, say, check the digital certificate on a file. But there are some behaviors that you would not expect. Although that program can be made to do those things, they would stand out. So you can't say the program's bad, but at some point in its behavior you'll go, now it's gone too far. And then you get some hint about what it's trying to do next, don't you? Which is equally important, that you guys can't just, we found the file and we blocked it. Sometimes it's what would have happened next that you actually need to know in order to pick out the threats that would come after the threat that you're seeing now.
And that touches on another interesting aspect of today's landscape. So historically, evil.exe runs. We might detect the file, we might detect some malicious behavior, we clean it from your system. You spoke a lot about lol bins. So obviously we don't, when we detect PowerShell doing something malicious, we don't remove PowerShell from that system.
I found Windows doing something bad. Wipe the disk.
We basically blocked that process. We stopped that process doing what it was about to do and terminated. But PowerShell still exists on the physical system.
Yeah.
But actually, today's attackers are very different from yesterday's attackers as well. Today's attackers are all about, they have a goal, they have a purpose. The old old model was more spray and pray, if you like. If somebody blocks the attack, okay, bad luck, they give up. And essentially there's no human presence there. If the attack works, data is stolen, a machine becomes compromised, whatever it happened to be. But if the attack was blocked, nothing else happens on the system. Today's attacks, actually, there's a much more of a human element. So typically, when a lot of attacks we see today, and this is typified by lots of the ransomware attacks, where the crooks are specifically trying to target certain organizations with their ransomware creations. When something is blocked, they try again. And they keep on retrying. And so as we're blocking stuff, I'm blocking different types of malicious behavior.
Right.
There's something behind the scenes, someone behind the scenes, some threat group behind the scenes. Maybe it's automated, maybe there's a human physically there almost interacting with it, retrying.
So 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where you got, one computer in your network, you got, we found this brand new, previously unknown word malware.
Yes.
We've deleted the file and cleaned it up, and we write it in the log, and everyone goes into the meeting and ticks it off and claps each other on the back. Great job done. Ready for next month.
Today it's very different.
That might actually, although it's a success to block the thing, that wasn't the attack.
No.
That was just I wonder what brand of smoke detectors they use, kind of test.
Exactly.
And they're not planning on using that malware. They're just trying to guess what protection have you got, what's turned on, which directories are included, which directories are excluded from your scanning, what ambient settings have you got.
And a lot of what we talk about today is about active adversaries. Active adversaries, they get lots of press, lots of attention, and there's the concept of the whole MITRE attack framework. So the MITRE attack framework is essentially a Bible, a dictionary, if you like, of a combination of tactics, the verticals, techniques, the horizontals. I think there's 14 tactics, and I don't know how many techniques, hundreds.
Can be a bit dizzying.
It's essentially a dictionary of the different types of things, different types of technique that could be used on a system for good or bad, essentially. But it's essentially aligned to attackers and active adversaries. And that lets us kind of label, and if you like, it's a taxonomy of what an active adversary might do when on a system.
Right, because in the old days, I mean, you and I will remember this because we've both spent our time writing comprehensive malware descriptions, the kind of things that were necessary 15, 20 years ago. That you were talking about evil.exe, and because most threats back then were viruses, in other words, they spread themselves and they were self-contained, so they would work without the internet. Once we had it,
you could document A to Z exactly what it did on the system.
So a lot of malware back in that day, if you look at how they hid themselves and how they went into memory and polymorphism, all that stuff, a lot of them were a lot more complicated to analyze than stuff today. But once you knew how it worked, you knew what every future generation would possibly look like. You could write a complete description.
Yes.
Now you just can't do that. You go, well, this malware downloads some other malware. Well, what malware? I don't know.
A simple example, just a simple loader. It runs, it periodically connects out. The attacker has the ability to fire in some sort of encoded blob. Typically, so for example, let's suppose it's a DLL, a dynamic link library, a module, some essentially executable code, and it will run that code. So what does that threat do? Well, it depends entirely on what the attacker sends down the wire once it's...
And that could change by day, hour by hour. It could change by source IP, like are you in Germany? Are you in Sweden? Are you in Britain?
We see that
depending
quite often.
on what we're doing. It could also say, hey, you already connected.
Yep.
So we've got the malware. Obviously, coming back to make sure we'll feed you Notepad or some innocent file the next time.
And they have the attackers typically will have techniques they use to try and spot. We use a lot of automation in what we do. Obviously, we do. And so they'll try and recognize when it's us trying to run their creation, so they don't feed us what might be the ultimate payload. They don't want us to see the payload. They only want victims to see that payload. And so there's a whole variety of kind of things like that just make
so you get something that innocent looking, and you think, oh, it's just a marketing campaign or something benign.
We've seen a variety of things. Sometimes things just exit quietly. Sometimes they just run calc or Notepad or something obviously silly. Sometimes we might get a rude message pop up. But typically they'll try and keep the ultimate payload reserve that for the.
And that also means that if they
victims.
have, glibly used the word polymorphism earlier. That was very common in viruses back in the day, where every time the virus copied itself to a new file, it would basically permute its code, often from a very complicated way, even rewriting its own algorithm for doing the encryption of the software.
But it was self-contained. The
but
virus
you could
itself.
get the engine that did the scrambling. Now the crooks keep that to themselves.
That's on a server somewhere else.
They're turning the handle in the background. And also, when you mentioned loaders, loaders people may have heard of things like Bootloader, Bazaar Loader, sort of well-known brand names. Now, in some cases, there are gangs of crooks. That's all they do. They don't write the malware that comes next. They just say, "What would you like us to load? Give us the URL and we'll inject it for you."
It's just the evolution of bots.
The loading service.
How did the original bot authors from kind of 15, 20 years ago, how did they make money? They essentially compromised networks of machines. Botnets, that's essentially what botnet is. Lots of machines under their command. And then they could basically rent out that network. They could be for distributed denial of service. So get all of these infected machines to kind of hit one web server, for example, and take out that web server. It could be quite commonly for spam, as you've already mentioned. And so the natural evolution of that, in some sense, is today's loader. If somebody has a system infected with a loader, and that loader's calling home, and you essentially have a bot. You essentially have the ability to run stuff on that machine. And so just like you say, those cyber criminals don't need to be concerned with what's the ultimate payload. Is it ransomware? Is it data theft? They can just have a vehicle through which they can rent, essentially, the ability
and typically,
to infect those boxes.
it won't just be ransomware.
No.
That might be when you notice, and that'll get the
That's
headlines.
the problem with ransomware. Ransomware is almost the final payout. We've done everything we wanted to do, or we failed at everything else we were hoping to do. Let's just try ransomware, because as soon as the ransomware
we've logged all the keys, we've logged all the passwords now.
There's nowhere else to go.
Get.
So
we've stolen all the data.
Exactly. The final kind of cash out is ransomware. At that point, the user's aware, the administrator's aware. There's data loss, and so today's loader is almost an extension of, or an evolution of, if you like, yesterday's bot.
Fraser, I'm conscious of time, so given that you've painted a picture that clearly requires full-time work, full-time understanding. You're an expert researcher. You've been doing this for years. Not everybody can give up their day job in IT or sysadmin to have another day job to be the experts, to be you in the organisation. If you had to give 3 simple tips for what you should do or what you should not do today to deal with what is a more complicated, more fragmented sort of way of attacking from the crooks that gives us many more planes on which we need to defend, what would those 3 things be?
Well, it's always a tough question. I think the first one has to be having awareness and visibility into your organisation. This sounds simple, but for example, we quite often see attacks where the starting point of an attack was an unprotected box. So you have an organisation, they have a wonderful IT policy, they have products deployed across that network, properly configured. They might have a team of people that are watching for all the little sensors and all the data coming back from these products, but they have a domain controller that was unprotected, and the bad guys managed to get onto that. And then we have, within the whole MITRE attack framework, there's one lateral movement. Once the attacker is on a box, they will continue to try to laterally move from that box across the organisation, and that initial kind of foothold gives them a point from which they can do that. So visibility is the first point. It's really,
not
really
just
important
what you
thing.
know, you also have to know what you don't know.
What you don't know. So having visibility into what devices are in your network, that links up. Number 2, configuration. This is a bit of a thorny one. So no one likes to talk about policies and configuration. It's frankly quite dull. But again,
it's kind of important, though.
It's absolutely crucially important.
If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, as the old saying goes.
I think my one recommendation for that would be, if at all possible, use the recommended defaults. So as soon as you deviate away from recommended defaults, you're typically either turning stuff off, bad, or you're excluding certain things.
Yes.
So you might be, for example, excluding a particular folder. Now, that might be perfectly acceptable. You might have some custom application, some custom database application where you say, I don't want to scan files within this particular folder. It's not quite so good if you're excluding, for example, the Windows folder. So we've spoken a lot about
C:\\/ and all subdirectories.
And so exclusions,
that's where you end up, isn't it?
It is.
You add one, you add another, and then you don't go and review that. You end up that you basically have all the doors
Yeah.
And all the windows propped open.
It's a bit like a firewall. You block everything, you poke a few holes, fine. You keep on poking holes for the next 3 years, and before you know where you are, you have Swiss cheese as your firewall. Like it's not going to work. So that configuration is really important. And if at all possible, stick to the defaults.
Yeah.
Stick to the defaults, because those recommended defaults, they're recommended for a reason. So within our own products, for example, we have, when you deviate from those, quite often you'll get a red bar warning you that you're deviating from things, and you're basically disabling protection.
So if you're going to go off-piste, make sure you really
make sure you have good visibility. And I guess a third point then is acknowledge the skill set required. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is we spoke in...
Don't be afraid to call for help.
Don't be afraid to call for help. And security is complex. We like to think of it as simple. What 3 things can we do? What simple things can we do? Actually, the reality is today's security is very complicated and it's complex. And our products might try to kind of package that up in a fairly simple way and provide good levels of protection, good levels of visibility into different types of behavior happening in a network. But if you don't have the skill set or the resource, for that matter, to kind of process the events that are coming in and hitting your dashboard, find someone that does. And so, for example, using a managed service can make a massive difference to your security. And it can just remove that headache because someone else is
not
monitoring.
an admission of defeat, is it?
No,
it's
not
saying,
at all.
I can't do it myself. It's in the same way that you're saying, I'm thinking of having a new building created.
Yeah.
Should I be my own architect, or shall I find someone who's done it before?
Yeah, exactly. And we're talking 24/7, 365. So for someone to do that in-house is a massive undertaking. And we're also talking about kind of complex data. And we spoke about active adversaries and that type of attack. We know the bad guys. Even when we block stuff, they will continue to retry. They'll kind of change things up, and they'll continue to kind of get by our defenses. A good team that are looking at that data will recognize that type of behavior. And not only will they know that, oh, great, tick, something's been blocked, job done. Actually, that's not what it means to those type of personnel. Those people will think, okay, there's somebody repeatedly trying to get in through that door. That's quite a useful indicator to them, and they'll take action and they'll resolve the attack. So I think there are 3 pretty good pieces of advice there.
That's excellent, Fraser. Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. To everybody who's listening, thank you so much. Remember that there are 4 days in the Security SOS Week. So if you enjoyed this session, please tune in for the other 3. And it remains now only for me to say, until next time, stay secure.